Hello and welcome back to another video brought to you by Lit Happens with Adriel and Belle. If you're in this video today, it's because you are trying to understand the Module A rubric, the HSC English course, Textual Conversations for Advanced English. Teacher or student, all are welcome to find out some more. I'm going to take you through a couple of steps now and show you a few different things to help you really understand the rubric more deeply. The important thing with the rubric is it's your syllabus, okay? Teacher or student, it is telling you how to examine a text, how to engage with it, what to do, what to compose, and of course, we can't forget that the ultimate goal, the HSC at the end, the HSC question for Module A Textual Conversations comes from this rubric. So the deeper we know the rubric, the more connection we can have to the module itself, and the greater chance we have at responding in a way that maximizes our potential and our results. All right, so let's begin. I'm going to take you now through the next slide. And this is an opportunity to really have a look at and read the rubric. So if you're not sure where to find the rubric, if you haven't received it yet, you're looking for where to find it. It is from NESA. You need to go to the NESA website. You need to actually have a look, find the prescriptions document entitled Prescriptions, Modules, Electives, and Text 2019 to 2026. So everybody who's sitting the HSC this year in term 4 of 2025, this means you. And teachers of a year 12 class, this is the document that's going to help you find the rubrics for all of your HSC courses, regardless of whether you're doing standard or advanced. So I'm going to give you guys a moment. You can have a look at the link I've got on there to redirect you and take a look at the NESA rubric entitled Advanced Module A Textual Conversations. So once you've had a read, I just want to remind you of a few things. The rubric, so essential. It is where the HSC questions come from. Okay, it's the document and the explainer of what your student is actually meant to be learning that term. What the student is meant to be understanding in terms of a topic or a module, and also what they're meant to do with that topic and module, how it's going to guide not only their analysis of their prescribed text, but also how they respond to that prescribed text within a classroom level, within in-school assessment, and then ultimately within the HSC examination question that is given to them. So I've got a couple of points there to help you really consider the rubric. On a basic level, what does it actually mean? What is it suggesting we learn or suggesting students will need to do? What seems to be the key topic or the focus of that particular rubric or module? What is it asking students to understand? And what is it asking them to think, do, craft, or respond? And how does the rubric how can it actually become reflected within the prescribed text that you'll be studying? So some key takeaways for me while I'm looking at that rubric document and this idea of what does it mean? Well, it's asking about a pair of texts and how they have a textual conversation with one another. So ideas of how they converse, how they're connected, how they maybe interpenetrate or affect each other. So what you're really looking at here is a comparative study, okay? And you're delving into these ideas of intertextuality. So remember that when we say intertextuality, we're looking at this interrelationship between the two texts. In what ways are they connected? In what ways are they similar? In what ways are they different? Is the newer version or the newer text within the pair that you have selected, is it trying to recreate certain aspects from its original text? In terms of actual references or ideas or actual language features, structural elements, conventions. And then how does the meaning change, or how are extra layers to meanings made when the new, or I suppose more modern author and the more modern text utilizes its more modern context to reshape or reframe those ideas? And the reason intertextuality in this module is so important is because it actually influences our understanding of not just the earlier text and invites us to consider that, and not only the new text separately, but also might give us new insights into meanings across both the texts. So, the rubric is really about a comparative study into textuality. What seems to be the key topic here? It's really looking at how these texts converse or are in somewhat of a dialogue with each other. Now, depending on the pairing of texts that you have, you might have a pair of texts that are in a very literal dialogue where you have the newer text speaking back to the previous. So, for example, your Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, you have Ted Hughes in his poetry, in his more newer or more newest poetry, talking back to elements of Sylvia Plath's poetry, speaking back to specific points in her poetry, specific messages that she shaped, specific language forms and features as well. You might also have actually a dialogue that's a little bit more indirect, where perhaps the newer author is not per se talking to the previous author more deliberately, but rather that the conversation is occurring between the ideas and the language and how they're transposed into that newer context. So, this idea of conversing then brings up these key terms that you can see in the rubric. This idea that when you compare and you explore, you're actually looking at either resonances and connections or dissonances and differences. And by examining these, students can actually think about, well, how does the reframing of the older text by the new one give us new insights into the text? Are there certain things that are being mirrored? Are aspects, ideas, points of views, thematic concerns, language features, are they aligning? Or is there actually a collision and a reframing and a divergence from the original work? So, what it's actually asking students to understand is that texts are shaped by their time, by the influence of context, by the influence of values, and that changes the meaning that has been made in the text. And so, therefore, students can actually delve into both their texts in their own right, in their own context and values, but when they actually look at them together, what enrichment is made, what deepening in the sense of values is had there with that connection. So, in terms of then about asking what students are meant to do, they're really asked to do a few things. They're meant to identify aspects, interpret, analyze, and then ultimately make that evaluation, make a judgment on the connections, the features, the conventions, context, values, purposes, ideas, so forth, and actually determine what is enriching about this. Why is this comparative study? What insight is it offering when looking at these sets of text together as opposed to separately? And the other thing that they need to think about is developing this sense of an appreciation, if not an enjoyment of the text. So we're not always going to have students that really love the text like we might. I mean, there might be aspects that they connect to. The core thing is for them to have that sense of appreciation. It might not be your form or your style, but what can you appreciate from the text? And usually that's where the values come in. What human and universal values are being represented through the text that really resonate despite the time differences and despite the difference in the text? And in getting students to think about, well, what resonates for you, what connection do you see, and what value stands out, you're starting to get them on this idea of appreciation. And in this module, it's not only the context of the text in the time that it was created, but the student themselves is also very powerful in this interaction of comparative text. Because as the rubric states, they need to bring their own contextual knowledge and their own influences, and that's going to shape their perspective and interpretation as well. So ultimately, in terms of how they need to respond, what they need to write about, what they need to craft, there's opportunities for them to respond imaginatively, interpretively, and critically and analytically, and looking at these common textual features, concepts, and values among the texts. They'll then analyze the various ways that the language forms, maybe encouraging this textual conversation. So looking at particular techniques such as maybe motif, illusion, textuality, which we talked about, to help not only connect the text and show the resonances, but also to look at how the newer or younger author or the newer text might actually be engaging more innovatively or in a different way with, language forms and features and context to help reshape meaning. And so once they have that understanding and that connection, they need to appropriately respond through analysis and through evaluative language, and ultimately an essay question about how the two texts and their pair of texts are engaging conversation. What is forming this dialogue? In what way are the texts conversing? Is it about ideas? Is it about context? Is it about values? And in what ways is the language enabling that to occur? What types of techniques do we just see that connect them, show the resonances? And in what ways do the texts diverge from each other and why? And then ultimately, what understanding does that give on students and the connection of these texts? If I'm thinking about ways that the rubric is reflected in the prescribed text, it's why these texts. Why is that combination set for study? What kind of enrichment comes forth from having studied these texts, not independently, but as a connected set? So now if you want to break the rubric down further, if you look at this like flow chart here, you can actually break it down more deeply in terms of the different types of the rubric statements, looking at the rubric key terms and meta language, and then coming up with your own synonyms and supporting meta language, which I'll get to shortly. So in terms of types of rubric statements, you might think about some of the statements, and, if you're a teacher, you hear this quite often, that there are like about statements, or students learn to, or they're learning of. And then there are statements that are more skill statements. They are learning to, or they are learning for, or they're learning so that they can. So having a look at breaking down the rubric in that way will sort of help you solidify, okay, what understanding and knowledge do they have to have versus what do they actually have to practice and action and do in order to get to the end goal and the end result. So what you might find is that the content statements very much have some of the rubric or the meta language. So the content sentences and statements are really trying to explain what is meant by textual conversation. What are they going to have to know? They're going to have to know that the comparative text can reveal dissonances and resonances. They're going to have to know that that might reimagine or reframe. And then when you're looking at, well, what are they going to have to do? You might be looking at that more of that second or third paragraph. They're going to have to respond imaginatively. They're going to have to be interpretive. They're going to have to analyze and evaluate the textual features, conventions, context, values, and purpose. So I don't think we have to get in the nitty gritty of these, what's absolutely, because you might find some statements that lend themselves either way. So I don't think we need to get into the nitty gritty, but I think what we need to do is just have that recognition of, well, this is what they need to understand and have knowledge of in terms of the actual rubric and the ethos of the module. And then this is what they're going to actually have to put together and produce. And then for you in the classroom, that'll guide you between what key things do you maybe need to define and discuss and explore, and then what elements are going to have to be, workshopped and practiced and are put together in a sense. Now, the next segment of the flowchart is the rubric, and that becomes the meta language that students will use. And it's really important to use these rubric terms because they actually give students a way in for analysis. So I always like to have my students make sure they have a list of them, they know what they mean, they know ways in which they might be able to use them to help understand both the text separately and together. So for example, if I'm looking, a lot of the meta language for this module comes from that very first paragraph, the resonances, dissonances. So starting from there, what do they mean? What's the difference? How could we actually use that to examine and create some comparisons between the texts? I also like the idea of the reimagining and the reframing. And that lends itself quite nicely with context as well. And this idea that when we modernize, when we bring things into new contexts, a new meaning is made. But what I think is pretty key with this rubric too is not always is that new meaning singular and distinct, that it still has connections and a relationship and reflection back to the text that influenced it. And some others that stand out: mirror, align, collide, disparate issues, values, assumptions. Students need to have this understanding of the assumptions that we might make about text. So, assumptions that an audience in that time would have made, and also assumptions that modern audiences like themselves might have made. And also the perspectives. And ultimately, the perspective is what's going to really shape how the student develops a thesis and then engages with these texts. Now, the last point on that flowchart: synonyms and supportive meta language. So, this is really having the students, once they understand what the rubric terms are from the actual document itself, thinking about what other terms or ideas or concepts might actually enable and support them to develop more unique insights. So, what you would actually find is, if you look at band 6 exemplars from this module A section, when you're looking at them, students are going to use those rubric words in that first paragraph, but you'll start to see a pattern in that responses where they break away from just repeating those same words and use other synonyms that not only are just replicating that word, but are being used as a way to move off into a new track. So if I'm looking at the term align, you might look at connect, reaffirm, reestablish. And that language, when students are using those synonyms, they're actually going to be, or should be using those terms to then get into their analysis and introduce the evidence. So that way, the evidence is supporting the rubric, and therefore, whatever kind of interpretation they have with their deep analysis, it should fit the hallmarks of the questions that they're going to throw at them for this module, because they've really considered the ethos of this module. They've really honed in on the rubric, and they're using the rubric as an anchor to then go off and develop their own ideas and their own interpretations as well. Okay, now lastly in this video, if you've held on, well done, we're almost there. Now, this is something that I like to have some thought of when I start teaching the module, just for some direction. But I also find is quite useful also as a starting point with students if they do need that bit more guidance in direction, and they need kind of some sort of thesis to help orientate them when they're analyzing the text, which you're going to get up to after this rubric phase. So I'll always encourage them, and as a teacher, I like to do this too. I try and do a little bit of a rewrite of the textual conversation, because I always stress to students the thing with the conversation, and it's important for them with textual conversations to understand that adults and teachers and other people that are on the committee that creates these rubrics, it's written in that language, and so sometimes I find just rewriting the rubric, or even just a few dot points, it really demystifies the rubric, makes it a lot more accessible, because I feel once students have confidence with this is the rubric, or this is the topic, these are some things I'm going to have to understand, and these are some ways I'm going to have to look at the text, it really gives that sense of direction for everybody involved, for the teachers, for students, and just gives students that extra little bit of confidence that they have somewhat of a picture of what they're working towards. Now, once they've done a rewrite, what I try and then get them to do is have a go at developing a sort of thesis statement. And it's just rubric based. It's not connected to their text at all. It's just really a statement that helps them consolidate, what is the rubric? What are they learning? And ultimately why? The thesis is, I think, often the why we're doing it. What is the impact or the influence on values? And this would be really good for teachers to do, students to do as a whole class, do in small groups or pairs, throw some ideas out there, and have that as a starting point of this is what we're working towards. When we get to our prescribed text, we're coming back and looking at how they fit in within this rubric. And if you're somebody that likes to show your students exemplars or previous Band 6 release responses. Have a look at the introduction together. Have a look at how the rubric is being incorporated within the introduction. Have a look at where the thesis statement is and how it links to the rubric. In that way, you're sort of backward mapping the analysis that is going to be taking place over the next few weeks with your classroom. So just a simple way to do this is just to create a bit of a sentence stem. So I'll often pick some of the key term phrases and I might say something to students like, here is your sentence stem, finish it off. So it could say something like, resonances and dissonances within a comparative set of text enables readers or audiences to consider. And they might finish that off. Or something like, the reimagining of a text and the exploration of common and disparate issues allows values, assumptions, and perspectives to come forth in order to, and then students might finish that off. So just building this idea between this is the rubric and this is what we mean by textual conversations, but ultimately what is the end goal is to actually examine, well, what meaning does this have on audiences, both audiences from the original text and modern audiences? What meaning does this have? How do the values which coincide between the two, even if they're reshaped or formed differently because of their context, how do those values still stand? How do they shape understanding? How are they depicted? And what do they develop an appreciation or understanding of? And that idea of, well, that thesis of that appreciation and that understanding, once you get to your prescribed text, that might be the big umbrella core concept. And then students within the body paragraphs are examining how that big message that's coming across from the two texts actually plays out. And I think the beauty with the rubric thesis statements is they don't have to be pretty or elaborate. They just have to be a start, because then once you actually incorporate, your analysis and you've spent time doing that and you're starting to encourage that thesis development, well, students can actually go back, take that rubric statement or one of the ones done as a class, or you could even model it with them, and they could look at that rubric statement and then they could fill in the gaps now that they have the specific prescribed text, now that they know kind of what the key appreciation they have, and they can sub out some of the language, and then it becomes not just a rubric thesis statement but an actual textual thesis statement. And it can work in a variety of ways. It's just that way that we can backward map them to help encourage and structure them, and not only give them structure if perhaps they need a little bit more help to consolidate everything, but also just a little sample that, students that sometimes they just need to see something, then they go off and they make it their own. It's just that starting point. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the Module A Advanced Textual Conversations rubric.